Before the food hit the table, you knew the rules. You dressed before you left the house. You spoke when spoken to, and ate what was put in front of you. You said thank you to the waitress, like she was somebody's grandmother, because she was. You didn't act up in public. You represented. These weren't just restaurants. They were an extension of the front room, the good china, the Sunday standard. Black families didn't just eat here. They belonged here. And then, without warning, without apology, one by one, they were gone. Section 1. Mahalia Jackson's Glory Fried Chicken. The building looked like a church. That was not an accident. The architect who designed the locations of Mahalia Jackson's Glory Fried Chicken, a black architect named DeBerry McKissick, built structures with peaked roof lines and white brick facades that echoed the shape of a house of worship on blocks where the congregation already knew the name above the door. In predominantly black neighborhoods across Chicago, Memphis, Cleveland, Detroit, Jacksonville, Dallas, and Charlotte, those buildings went up one after another beginning in 1968. And when you walked inside, what you smelled was not fast food in the way that term had come to mean by then. What you smelled was fried chicken the way it was supposed to smell. Close, hot, and seasoned all the way through. The kind of smell that fills a building until it lives in the walls and stays there long after the food is gone. The woman whose name was on the sign was not a restaurant entrepreneur. She was the most celebrated gospel singer in the world, the Queen of Gospel, a woman whose voice had moved the March on Washington, and whose relationship with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was documented and deep. Mahalia Jackson had spent her life in black churches, black neighborhoods, black living rooms, and she understood what it meant for a name to carry trust. When the Nashville businessman John J. Hooker and the Memphis investors who launched the chain approached her, what they were proposing was not just a franchise operation. The civil rights leaders who stood at the groundbreaking of the first Mahalia Jackson location, including Benjamin Hooks, Joseph Lowery, and Ralph David Abernathy, described the moment in the press as a declaration of Negro economic independence. They meant it. The chicken was almost beside the point for that moment. The point was that the building, the fryer, the staff, and the paycheck were all black. Benjamin Hooks was not a minor figure. He had been the first black criminal court judge in the state of Tennessee. He left that position to become president of Mahalia Jackson's Chicken Systems Incorporated. That tells you something about how seriously the people involved took what this chain was trying to be. The Chicago Defender, the paper that had spent decades covering black American life, with more care and more accuracy than most of the country's press combined, described the operation plainly. Black-owned, managed, and staffed, hiring in the communities in which it operated. Every location that opened was supposed to be a neighborhood institution that kept money cycling in the neighborhood. You walked in for a two-piece and knew that the person who took your order, the person who packed your box, and the person who signed the payroll were all from somewhere close. That was not an accident. It was a specific, deliberate design. The menu was grounded in exactly what the name promised: fried chicken, seasoned in the way that anyone who grew up in a black household in the South or the Midwest would recognize on the first bite. Catfish, fish sandwiches, fried pies and sweet potato pie. And the soul bowl, which was a specific thing, and not just a marketing phrase. Chicken giblets over rice, ladled with gravy, priced so that the shift worker coming off a double could afford it without calculating anything in his head. At minimum wage in 1968, which was $1.60 an hour, a catfish picnic from the Mahalia Jackson menu cost roughly 2 hours of work. That was the price point they were aiming at. Affordable enough to be a regular stop, not a special occasion. The chain also offered something unusual for the fast food industry of that era. Employees received paid vacations and low-cost life insurance. There was major medical coverage. The company built a management school so that workers could move up through the system rather than staying permanently at the counter. These were not minor benefits. These were things that most of the industry did not extend to the people frying the chicken. The intent was to build something that functioned as an employer the way a good employer was supposed to function, not just a revenue machine. What made the rapid expansion possible was a partnership with Gulf Oil. The oil company had shuttered gas stations sitting empty across cities all over the country by the late 1960s, and the Mahalia Jackson chain converted those locations into franchise outlets, giving the brand a footprint that moved quickly from a regional idea into something that looked, briefly, like it might become a national institution. In Chicago alone, there were at one point 5 locations. The chain reached Milwaukee, Tallahassee, and beyond, and there were even locations in the Bahamas. The Southern Foodways Alliance later documented the chain as the first African-American-owned franchise in the South, which tells you something important about how overdue the concept was, and how much it needed to work. The food historian Marcia Chatelain, who wrote the definitive account of the relationship between fast food and Black America, documented how this moment fit into a broader pattern. In the late 1960s, Black celebrities across the country were lending their names and their faces to franchise operations aimed at keeping dollars circulating in Black communities. James Brown had a soul food chain. Muhammad Ali had a burger concept. The idea was that integration had opened certain doors without opening wallets, and that franchise ownership at the neighborhood level was one of the few tools available for doing something about that. The Mahalia Jackson chain was the most ambitious of those attempts, and the one that came closest to scaling into something lasting. And then it was gone. The chain shared investors and business infrastructure with Minnie Pearl's Chicken, a separate fried chicken operation out of Nashville, built around the country comedian who performed at the Grand Ole Opry, and both chains operated under the umbrella of John J. Hooker's company, Performance Systems Incorporated. In 1969, the Securities and Exchange Commission opened an investigation into the franchise sales practices of Hooker's company. No wrongdoing was ultimately found. Mahalia Jackson was cleared. Hooker was cleared. None of it mattered in the way that clearing usually matters, because the investigation itself was enough. The stock, which had been trading as high as $40 a share at the height of the franchise boom, fell to 50 cents. Performance Systems was effectively liquidated. The money that had been promised to build out the Mahalia Jackson locations dried up, and by 1971, the chain was in bankruptcy. Some sources place the final collapse in 1972. Either way, you walked past one of those church-shaped white brick buildings one day, and the lights were off. You did not have to understand the mechanics of a stock collapse to feel what happened in your neighborhood. What you felt was that the restaurant was there, and then it was not there, with no satisfying explanation attached to the disappearance. The building stood empty, or became something else, and the block that had briefly had its own institution went back to being just a block. The jobs went with it, the management school went with it, the paid vacation and the life insurance went with it. The money that had been moving through that neighborhood when the chain was operating did not go anywhere good. It simply stopped. What the chain had tried to do, and what the civil rights leaders who attended its groundbreaking understood it was trying to do, was thread something lasting into the economic life of Black communities at a specific moment when that kind of threading was both urgent and possible. A white-run company's investment vehicle collapsed under a federal investigation that found nothing, and the fallout fell, as fallout tends to fall, on the people who had built something in good faith and did not own the piece that broke. Writer Alice Randall, who researched the chain extensively for the Southern Foodways Alliance and grew up in Detroit in the years when these locations were operating, spoke to people who had eaten in them. She noted that none of them described the food as extraordinary. It was the idea of Mahalia on the bucket, Mahalia's name on the door, Mahalia's face representing a kitchen that was black from the floor up, that mattered to the people who walked in. The chicken was good. The meaning was better. One location survived the bankruptcy. A Nashville operator named E.W. Mayo purchased the rights and kept a version of the restaurant alive for decades, eventually making the place as famous for its fried pies as for the chicken. That final outpost, called Mayo's Fried Pies and Mahalia Jackson's Chicken, closed around 2008. By then, almost no one outside of food historians and the people who had actually eaten in one of the original locations remembered what the chain had been trying to be. But the people who remembered it the way you remember anything that was exactly what it said it was. A place in your neighborhood, built to look like a church, employing people from your block, serving food that tasted like somebody's grandmother made it. Gone not because the food was wrong or the need had passed, but because a business structure it had been tied to broke in the hands of people who were not the ones who needed it to hold. That restaurant tried to be something specific and permanent for its neighborhood, and came closer than most people know before a corporate collapse nobody on the block caused erased it in a single season. Up next, a place where the planning for the March on Washington happened over plates of food, and where a hostess quietly broke the law every day for 30 years. Section 2. Dooky Chase's Restaurant. The white tablecloth was the first thing. Not the food, not the gumbo, not the art covering every wall from the floor to where the ceiling started. The tablecloth. In New Orleans, in the late 1940s, in a city with one of the most developed restaurant cultures in the country, there was not a single fine dining establishment that would seat a black customer at a white cloth table. Not one. The French Quarter restaurants, the uptown establishments, the hotel dining rooms with their chandeliers and their printed menus, all of them closed to you by law, and by custom, and by the understanding that certain rooms in certain cities were simply not yours to enter. Leah Chase had worked in some of those rooms. She had waitressed in the French Quarter and watched how fine dining worked, what it required, what it communicated to the person sitting down. And when she and her husband took over the family sandwich shop on Orleans Avenue in the Treme neighborhood in the late 1940s, she brought all of that watching with her. What she built, steadily and with complete intention, was the first fine dining restaurant available to black New Orleanians. White tablecloths, proper place settings, a menu of Creole food, developed from her own family's recipes, and from the dishes she had observed in the whites-only restaurants where she had worked, and to which her own patrons had never been admitted. Shrimp clemenceau, a rich butter and garlic dish that existed in the fine dining rooms of the French Quarter, and nowhere else in the city that a black family could walk into and sit down. She put it on her menu. She put the white cloth on the table. She put African American art on the walls at a time when the museums were segregated and those artists had no public gallery for their work. Dooky Chase's was the first place in New Orleans where black artists could display their paintings to a public audience. That happened in a restaurant because every other public space was closed. The restaurant had started in 1939 as a corner stand in the Treme, selling po' boy sandwiches and lottery tickets, founded by Emile and Dooky Chase Sr. on Claiborne Avenue. They moved to Orleans Avenue in 1941, and the business grew into a bar and sandwich shop that served the neighborhood's working people. On Friday nights, men lined up at the bar to cash their paychecks, because there were no black-owned banks in New Orleans at the time, and Dooky's had the cash flow and knew its patrons well enough to extend that service. A drink while you waited. A po' boy when your turn came. Friday at Dooky's was a neighborhood institution before it was anything else. Then, in 1946, Edgar Dooky Chase Jr. married Leah Lang, and the restaurant began its second life. Leah was 23 years old and had spent her working years in the hospitality industry, observing everything. She was not content with a sandwich shop. She understood what was missing in New Orleans for black residents who wanted to eat well and be treated with dignity in a room that had been designed to treat them that way. Over the following decade, she transformed the building on Orleans Avenue into something the city had never offered its black population before. The Times-Picayune, in its obituary for Leah Chase in 2019, described Dooky's plainly. It was not only the only white tablecloth restaurant for the city's black residents and visitors, but also the place where black and white New Orleanians mapped their strategy for the civil rights movement when interracial meetings were illegal. That second part of that sentence requires sitting with for a moment. Interracial assembly in New Orleans in the 1950s and early 1960s was not merely frowned upon, it was against the law. State and city ordinances prohibited most forms of mixed-race gathering. Leah Chase ignored them. She seated black and white patrons together at her tables from the beginning, invited labor organizers and civil rights attorneys and activists of all races to use her dining rooms for meetings, and kept doing it with enough calm authority that the building never got raided. She described it later in interviews as simple. If you tried to stop what was happening at her tables, you would have had to take on half of New Orleans to do it, and nobody wanted that trouble. The people who ate in those rooms were not ordinary dinner guests passing an evening. Thurgood Marshall sat in those dining rooms while working on the legal cases that would become Brown v. Board of Education. A.P. Terode, the civil rights attorney who spent decades dismantling segregation in Louisiana's courts, met at those tables. The Freedom Riders came through. The Montgomery bus boycott was organized in part from information gathered at Dooky Chase's, where organizers from New Orleans and Baton Rouge met with Martin Luther King Jr. to share what they had learned from the Baton Rouge bus boycott that preceded Montgomery. The upstairs dining room, which the family called the upper room, hosted sessions where the strategy for the March on Washington was developed. Leah Chase cooked for all of it. She described it in the plainest possible terms, in interviews before she died. "We changed the course of America in this restaurant over bowls of gumbo." The gumbo was real, and it was specific. Not a generic Creole gumbo, but Leah Chase's Creole gumbo, developed and refined over decades, seasoned in the way that reflected her training and her family's cooking and the particular richness of New Orleans Creole tradition. She also made a gumbo zerbs, a dish of greens cooked together with various meats, served specifically on Holy Thursday in the Catholic tradition that ran deep through New Orleans. The fried chicken was the item that Martin Luther King Jr. ordered reliably when he came in, always with candied yams and collard greens. Barack Obama visited during his 2009 inauguration period and added hot sauce to her gumbo without asking, and she corrected him at the table in front of his staff. She was 95 years old at the time and had been cooking in that kitchen for 70 years, and she was not going to have hot sauce in her gumbo. Ray Charles mentioned Dooky Chase's by name in a song. Walt Disney's animators used Leah Chase as the inspiration for Princess Tiana in The Princess and the Frog, the first Black Disney princess, whose story centered on a New Orleans restaurant. Quincy Jones ate there. Duke Ellington ate there. Jesse Jackson ate there. Beyoncé and Jay-Z ate there. The list of people who understood that Dooky Chase's was a mandatory stop in New Orleans runs for pages, and it crosses every line of category: musicians, presidents, civil rights leaders, athletes, writers, chefs who built their own careers on what they learned from watching Leah Chase work. And then Dooky Chase Jr. died in 2016 at the age of 88, and Leah Chase died on June 1, 2019, at the age of 96. And the restaurant that had been the physical expression of two people's combined vision for more than 7 decades continued without the people who had made it what it was. The building still stands on Orleans Avenue. The restaurant still opens its doors. The Chase family still runs it. In 2025, the James Beard Foundation named it an American classic. The gumbo is still on the menu. But the tremenée that surrounded it for those 70 years, the neighborhood that was among the oldest Black communities in North America, has been transformed by Hurricane Katrina, by the displacement that followed, by a decade of rising rents and shifting demographics that moved the original community out of the blocks where they had lived. The restaurant that was built to serve that community exists in a neighborhood that community no longer largely inhabits. You can still eat Leah Chase's gumbo recipe. Her family preserved it and still makes it the way she made it. But a recipe is not a room, and a room is not the same room without the people the room was built for sitting in it. What existed on Orleans Avenue from 1941 through the decades of Leah Chase's kitchen was specific to those people in that neighborhood at that moment in history. The March on Washington was planned there. The Montgomery boycott was coordinated there. Black artists showed their work on those walls for the first time. A woman put a white tablecloth on a table in a city that said she could not, and kept it there for 70 years. That version of the room is gone. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That restaurant fed a movement and housed it and kept its secrets for decades inside a dining room that was technically breaking the law the entire time. Up next, a chain that Black families in the South packed into every Sunday for 30 years, built by a man who had already made one fried chicken empire and understood exactly what he was doing the second time. Section 3. Pascal's Restaurant. Atlanta hot food had to come by taxi. The original Pascal's, a 30-seat luncheonette at 831 West Hunter Street in Atlanta, had no stove when it opened in 1947, and neither of the two brothers who opened it owned a car. Robert Pascal prepared the food at his house, and a cab carried it to the shop while it was still warm. That arrangement lasted until the brothers could afford a proper kitchen, which they eventually could, because the food was good enough that the neighborhood decided immediately it was going to eat there, and kept deciding that every day for the next 50 years. The fried chicken was Robert's recipe, developed in those early years when the menu was still finding its shape, and the recipe was never written down in any form that left the family. It is still described, in every account of Pascal's across 7 decades, simply as the secret recipe, because no more specific description was ever made available. James and Robert Pascal were from Thompson, Georgia, a small town east of Atlanta, and they had worked in hospitality before opening the luncheonette. They understood service in the specific way that people understand it when they have spent years providing it to others without being extended it themselves. The restaurant they opened on West Hunter Street was in the heart of Atlanta's Black Business District, close enough to the Atlanta University Center, which housed Morehouse, Spelman, Clark Atlanta, and Morris Brown, that students and faculty became regulars almost immediately. The block was already busy with Black-owned businesses. What Pascal's added was a place to sit down and eat well, which was a different thing from what the block already had. By 1959, the business had grown past what the original 30-seat luncheonette could hold. The brothers took out a loan from Citizens Trust Bank, one of the few financial institutions in Atlanta that would extend credit to Black borrowers, and moved to a larger building across the street at 830 West Hunter Street. The new location seated 90 in the coffee shop and 125 in the main dining room. They expanded the menu to match the space. The fried chicken stayed at the center of everything, served the way Robert had developed it, with candied yams and collard greens on the side, which was the combination that Martin Luther King Jr. ordered every time he came in. He came in often enough that the Pascal brothers eventually gave him a private suite in the Motor Hotel they added to the property in 1967, a 6-story, 125-room building that was the first Black-owned hotel in Atlanta, constructed for $2 million and employing over 140 people. King used the suite as a planning space. The civil rights movement had an office at Pascal's. The people who gathered in those dining rooms across the 1960s were not a coincidental collection of notable figures. John Lewis ate there, Julian Bond ate there, Jesse Jackson, Andrew Young, Hosea Williams, Ralph David Abernathy, Stokely Carmichael, Fannie Lou Hamer, Joseph Lowery. The restaurant became known as Atlanta's Black City Hall, which was accurate in the specific sense that decisions of municipal and national consequence were made at its tables. The planning sessions preceding the March on Washington were held at Pascal's. The Poor People's Campaign was organized there. Shirley Chisholm and Adam Clayton Powell Jr. both came through. By the late 1980s, a political observer in Atlanta would tell you that no serious candidate for anything could afford to skip Pascal's, because Pascal's was where the Black community took the measure of people who wanted its vote. None of this happened by accident. The hostess who worked the front of the restaurant for more than 30 years, a woman named Ora Bell Sherman, seated white and Black patrons together every day in deliberate defiance of Atlanta's segregation laws. She made the seating decision. Nobody told her to do it. She simply did it, because the restaurant was not going to operate any other way, and the Pascal brothers were not going to tell her to stop. The building had a colored-only business license and a colored-only liquor license, the legal categories that segregation imposed, and inside those legal constraints, the restaurant ran a dining room that did not observe those categories. That arrangement held for years, sustained not by any legal protection, but by the specific weight that Pascal's carried in the city, a weight that even the people who enforced Atlanta's segregation laws did not want to spend their credibility challenging. In December of 1960, the brothers opened La Carousel Lounge, adjacent to the restaurant, a 200-seat jazz club that became the only formal nightclub in Atlanta open to Black patrons, and the only venue in the city where Black and white audiences regularly sat together to hear live music. Aretha Franklin performed at La Carousel. Dizzy Gillespie performed there, and Ramsey Lewis, and Lou Rawls, and Gladys Knight, and Wes Montgomery, and Herbie Hancock, and Cannonball Adderley, and Quincy Jones. The list of musicians who came through that 200-seat room in an Atlanta neighborhood reads like a full accounting of American jazz in its peak years. After a performance, the musicians went next door and ate. The restaurant and the club were a single institution, even when they were technically two separate businesses, because you did not go to one without eventually ending up in the other. What closed that institution was not a single catastrophic event, but a long erosion. By the early 1990s, the neighborhood around West Hunter Street had changed. The Atlanta University Center was still there, but the surrounding Black business district had thinned, and the foot traffic that had sustained Pascal's through 30 years of growth was no longer what it had been. In 1996, after years of declining business, Clark Atlanta University purchased the entire property, the restaurant, La Carousel, and the Motor Hotel, for $3 million. The brothers accepted the terms and relinquished all decision-making rights. Clark Atlanta converted the hotel into a student dormitory. The restaurant stayed open for a few more years under university management, still serving Robert's fried chicken recipe, which had been included in the sale, and then closed in 2003, when the university announced plans to demolish the historic structure. A public outcry resulted in a congressional grant of $100,000 to preserve the building. The building was saved. It stood empty for years, boarded up on the street where the march had been planned. Robert Paschal died in 1997. James Paschal died in 2008. In 2002, James had partnered with the Atlanta developer Herman J. Russell to open a new Paschal's on Northside Drive in the Castleberry Hill neighborhood, a $6 million restaurant with a space designed to resemble the original Le Carrousel. The food there is good. The fried chicken is Robert's recipe, or a version of it that the family considers faithful to the original. The photographs on the walls show who sat in the old building and what they were doing there, but the original restaurant's son, Curtis Paschal, described the difference plainly in an interview. He said he remembered Paschal's as a community. He said they didn't have that anymore. What he meant was not the food, and not the name. What he meant was the specific gravity that a place accumulates when it has been the room where serious things happened for long enough that being in the room itself means something. That gravity lives in a location, not in a recipe or a brand. It was at 830 West Hunter Street, now 830 Martin Luther King Jr. Drive, in a building that stood empty and boarded for a decade after the last plate of fried chicken came out of Robert Paschal's kitchen. That was simply where it was. That restaurant held 50 years of the most serious political work in the American South, inside a building that eventually got sold and boarded up, while the recipe moved to a new address. Up next, a place in Washington where Ella Fitzgerald ate after her sets, where Dr. King stopped in whenever he was in the city, and where the neighborhood around it was nearly destroyed before the restaurant outlasted everyone who tried to close it. Section 4. Ben's Chili Bowl and Black Broadway. The music came out of the Lincoln Theater first. You heard it before you saw the sign, before you smelled anything. The sound carrying from the venue's open doors onto U Street in Northwest Washington on a Friday or Saturday night in the late 1950s. Jazz and rhythm and blues moving through the air of a block that had been the center of Black Washington for 30 years by then. The Lincoln was next door to a vacant building that had been, in a previous life, the city's first silent movie house, a theater called the Minnehaha, built in 1910, that had transitioned to a pool hall and then sat empty. In 1958, a man named Ben Ali saw the property and understood what it could become. Ben Ali had come to Washington from Trinidad in 1945, studied at Howard University, started dental school, left dental school, and spent the following years driving taxis, waiting tables, and selling real estate while he looked for what he was actually going to do. The building on U Street was what he was going to do. He renovated it and opened Ben's Chili Bowl on August 22, 1958. He was 31 years old. 7 weeks later, he married Virginia Rollins, the woman he had met at the Industrial Bank while the renovation was underway, and the two of them ran the restaurant together for the next 50 years. The neighborhood they opened into was unlike any other block in Washington. U Street in the middle of the 20th century was Black Broadway, the name the city had given to a stretch of theaters, jazz clubs, restaurants, law offices, insurance companies, newspapers, and banks that existed because the Jim Crow laws that segregated Washington had forced black residents to build their own parallel economy on their own streets. The Lincoln Theater was there. The Howard Theater was there. Bohemian Caverns, the jazz club in the basement of a U Street building, was there. Crystal Caverns, Club Bali. More than 300 black-owned businesses operated within a few blocks of each other. A self-sufficient commercial district that had grown across the first half of the century because there was no other choice. Duke Ellington was born on U Street, in a house a short walk from the block, where Ben Ali would open his restaurant. When Ellington and Cab Calloway and Ella Fitzgerald and Billie Holiday and Louis Armstrong came through Washington, they performed in U Street's theaters and ate on U Street's block. They were not welcome in the downtown venues that white audiences attended, so they built something better. Ben's Chili Bowl opened into that world and immediately became part of it. The musicians who played the Lincoln Theater came next door afterward because they were hungry, and because Ben Ali's chili was exactly what you wanted after a late set. The half smoke, which was the signature item, was a coarsely ground pork and beef sausage griddled until it snapped when you bit into it, served in a steamed bun under chili that Ben had developed from the flavors he grew up with in Trinidad, peppery and thick and complex in a way that distinguished it completely from any other chili in the city. Cab Calloway, according to the restaurant's own historian, was known to eat 2 or 3 half-smokes after his performances at the Lincoln, the heat of the chili sending him dancing up the aisle between the counter and the wall. Martin Luther King Jr. had an office 2 blocks away at the corner of 14th and U Streets, and stopped at Ben's when he was in the city. The restaurant was not a destination for notable people. Notable people came because the block was already theirs, and Ben's was the best thing on it. Then April 4th, 1968, arrived. King was shot in Memphis on a Thursday evening. By nightfall, the news had reached Washington, and by the following morning, U Street was burning. The riots that followed King's assassination destroyed or severely damaged most of the commercial district that Black Washington had built across 4 decades on U Street. Dozens of businesses closed and never reopened. The physical infrastructure of Black Broadway, the theaters, the restaurants, the storefronts, was gutted block by block in the days after the assassination, while the National Guard moved through the streets under curfew. Ben's Chili Bowl stayed open. The city government asked Ben and Virginia Ali to keep the restaurant operating during the 4 days of unrest because it was one of the few places on the block that could function as a neutral point. They served police officers and firefighters and National Guard soldiers. They served protesters and activists. Stokely Carmichael went to the mayor of Washington, Walter Washington, and asked him to exempt Ben's specifically from the curfew so people would have a place to gather and eat. The mayor said yes. The restaurant was that important to the immediate situation, and everyone involved knew it. The Washington Post later described Ben's as probably the only business on U Street that survived both the 1968 riots and the construction of the Metro Green Line, a description that captures exactly what the following 30 years were like for the block around it. Because the riots were not the last assault on the neighborhood. After 1968, the businesses that had not been destroyed by the fires simply closed over the following years, as the community that had supported them dispersed. The drug epidemics of the 1970s and 1980s, heroin first and then crack cocaine, moved through U Street and removed what the riots had not. The population that remained was poorer and less stable than the community that had built Black Broadway, and for 20 years after King's death, the block existed in a sustained depression that made the restaurants and clubs and offices of the 1950s feel like something from a different city. Ben and Virginia Ali held on with one employee at times, kept the griddle on, served the people who were still there, and did not close. Then in the early 1990s, the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority began constructing the U Street Metro station directly across the street from Ben's, which required tearing up the block for several years and removed whatever foot traffic had survived. Ben's put a banner in the window that said simply, "We survived Metro." The station opened in 1991. Slowly, the neighborhood began to change again, though not in the direction that would have returned it to what it had been. The Metro brought new residents to U Street, younger people with higher incomes who came for the transportation access and the reasonable rents, and who transformed the block into something different from anything it had been before. The businesses that opened around Ben's in the 1990s and 2000s were not the businesses of Black Broadway. They were wine bars and boutiques, and the amenities of a neighborhood that was gentrifying, with speed, and without much attention to what had been there before. Ben's Chili Bowl is still on U Street. It is still at 1213 U Street, in the building that was the Minnehaha Silent Movie Theater in 1910, with most of the original furniture from 1958 still inside. The revenue grew at 10% annually through the 1990s and reached $1.5 million by 2005. The James Beard Foundation named it one of America's classics in 2004. Barack Obama ate there in January of 2009, a few days before his inauguration. No DC politician, as the Washington Post put it in the late 1990s, would dream of running for office without stopping at Ben's. Ben Ali died in 2009 at the age of 82. Virginia Ali, who was 24 years old when they opened together, continued at the restaurant. What disappeared was not Ben's Chili Bowl. What disappeared was the 300 black-owned businesses around it. The theaters where Ellington and Fitzgerald performed. The jazz clubs in the basement rooms. The insurance companies and newspapers and law offices that made U Street a self-sufficient world during the decades when no other world was available. Ben's survived because Ben and Virginia Ali held on when holding on was genuinely difficult, and because the city understood, even in its worst years, that some things you do not let go. But the restaurant that sits on U Street now is not surrounded by the world that made it. That world burned in 1968, dissolved in the following 20 years, and did not come back in any form its original builders would have recognized. Ben's is a survivor in a neighborhood that no longer belongs to the people who built the block. That is one kind of disappearance. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That restaurant survived riots and drug epidemics and metro construction and outlasted every force that tried to erase the block around it, and ended up surrounded by a neighborhood that had replaced the world it was built for. Up next, a woman in Harlem who bought a luncheonette with money her mother raised by mortgaging the family farm and fed the neighborhood for 60 years before the neighborhood changed into something that barely remembered she was there first. Section 5. Sylvia's Restaurant, Harlem. She had never been inside a restaurant before the day she walked into one looking for work. Sylvia Woods was born in 1926 in Hemingway, South Carolina, raised on her mother's farm, and when she and her husband Herbert joined the Great Migration north and arrived in Harlem in 1944, she found factory work on Long Island and took the commute every day until she passed a luncheonette on 126th Street with a help wanted sign in the window. She walked in. The owner, a man named Johnson who ran the counter operation, asked if she had restaurant experience. She said she had been cooking her whole life but had never worked in a restaurant, and she promised him that if he gave her the chance, she would be his best worker. 16 years later, when Johnson was ready to sell the business, he sold it to her. She was his best worker. She could not get a bank loan. This was 1962, and a black woman in New York, trying to secure commercial financing for a restaurant purchase, was not going to find a bank that would do it. Johnson knew this and told her what to do. He told her to ask her mother to mortgage the farm in South Carolina. Her mother, Julia Presley, agreed without hesitating, and the farm went up as collateral for $20,000, which was still less than Johnson's asking price, but he turned over the keys anyway because he wanted Sylvia to have it. Within a year of opening, Sylvia Woods had paid her mother back in full, with interest. The farm came off the mortgage. The luncheonette at 328 Malcolm X Boulevard, between 126th and 127th Streets, became hers in every sense. What she opened into was a Harlem that has not existed for a long time. In 1962, Malcolm X Boulevard was lined with restaurants and bars and jazz clubs and beauty parlors and barbershops and churches and all the density of commercial life that a neighborhood generates when it is genuinely alive. The community that surrounded Sylvia's in those early years had been built by the Great Migration, layer by layer, since the 1910s and 1920s. People from Georgia and the Carolinas and Virginia and Florida had come north along the railroad routes and settled in Harlem and built something that reflected where they had come from, while being completely its own thing. The food that Sylvia cooked was the food those people's mothers had cooked: fried chicken, and collard greens, and candied yams, and cornbread, and black-eyed peas, and eating it on 126th Street was not eating Southern food in a northern city so much as it was eating home food in a neighborhood that understood what home meant. The restaurant started with 15 stools and 6 booths, and a counter where Sylvia stood and took orders and cooked, and knew every person who came in by name, or learned their name quickly. She did not use the word customer. The people who came to Sylvia's were guests, and she treated them accordingly, which meant she fed them the way you feed people in your house when you want them to feel that the house is theirs. During the 1980s, when the crack epidemic moved through Harlem and removed the commercial and social fabric from entire blocks, Sylvia Woods rose early every morning to feed the people fighting addiction in the neighborhood, opened the door to people who had nothing, and kept the restaurant running through years when every other business on the block was shuttering. She did not publicize this, It was simply what you did when the neighborhood needed it. Al Sharpton was a regular for decades, and he described the social weight of the place in a line that captures it precisely. He said he ate at Sylvia's even when he was not hungry, because if you were not seen there regularly, the assumption in Harlem was that you had retired. That is the specific gravity a restaurant achieves when it has been the center of a community long enough that your absence from it requires explanation. James Brown was known to come through. Muhammad Ali, Diana Ross. The political figures came because Harlem came, and Harlem's political endorsement was negotiated at tables like Sylvia's. Bill Clinton ate there, Barack Obama ate there, Nelson Mandela ate there. For the first 17 years of its existence, Sylvia's was essentially unknown outside Harlem, and a specific community of European and Japanese tourists who had always come to the neighborhood for the jazz and the culture. The restaurant ran entirely on its neighborhood. Then, in 1979, a food critic named Gail Green reviewed it in New York Magazine, and the review exposed the restaurant to a readership that had not been to Harlem since before Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, which was Green's own approximate timeline, stated without apparent embarrassment. The review brought a new wave of customers from downtown and from out of town who did not know the restaurant as a neighborhood institution and experienced it purely as a destination. The food was the same, the room was the same, but the audience for the room had begun to change, and the change was only going to go in one direction. By the time Sylvia Woods died on July 19, 2012, at the age of 86, the restaurant had expanded from 15 stools and 6 booths to a complex that seats 450 people, absorbing neighboring storefronts as they went dark over the years. Each addition tacked onto the original in a way that gives the dining room a particular character, a sense of rooms accumulated rather than designed, which is the physical record of a business that grew because the neighborhood needed it to grow. The Woods family still owns the building. They placed a no-sale clause in the family trust, specifically to prevent the property from being sold, as the real estate pressure around it intensified, which was a decision made with full awareness of what was happening to the blocks surrounding them. What was happening was that Harlem was gentrifying at speed. The same neighborhood that had sustained Sylvia's for 60 years, whose families had come from South Carolina and Georgia and Alabama, and built a community dense enough to support a restaurant on a personal basis, was being displaced by rising rents and the arrival of residents who came to Harlem for the transportation and the square footage and the history of the neighborhood without being part of that history. The jazz clubs were gone. The barbershops that had been on the block for 40 years were gone. The beauty parlors and the insurance offices and the black-owned businesses that had lined the avenue when Sylvia walked in looking for a job were gone. The high-rise condos that replaced them did not need a soul food restaurant the way the community that had been there before did. Sylvia's granddaughter, Trennis Woods Black, who started as a busgirl at 13 and grew up in the restaurant, described it as bittersweet. The neighborhood was experiencing a rebirth, she said, and it had not been this busy since her grandmother and grandfather were going to the different hotspots. Rents were going up, she said, and Harlemites could not afford to live there for a lot of different reasons. The restaurant is still at 328 Malcolm X Boulevard. The family still runs it. The fried chicken is still the fried chicken. But Sylvia Woods spent 60 years cooking for a community, and the community she was cooking for has largely been moved to other parts of the city by forces that had nothing to do with the quality of the cornbread. The building stayed. The neighborhood it was built to feed did not. That is one kind of disappearance, and it is the quieter one. That restaurant held its ground, while the neighborhood around it changed into something that required a no-sale clause in the family trust to keep from taking the building too. Up next, a chain that spread across the American South in the 1970s and handed families a Sunday tradition, built on a biscuit, made from scratch before 5:30 in the morning, and then lost everything it had built in a single bankruptcy filing. Section 6. Mrs. Winner's Chicken and Biscuits. Sunday morning parking lots in the American Southeast have a specific quality between 9 and 11 that people from elsewhere do not always understand. They are full, and the people filling them are dressed in their best clothes, and there is a particular feeling in the air that is neither the formality of the church they have just come from, nor the ease of the home they are headed back to. It is the middle hour, the reward hour, the hour when the week's obligations have met themselves and the afternoon has not yet arrived with its own requirements. You are in your good clothes. You have been in a pew. You are not ready to cook. The parking lot at Mrs. Winner's Chicken and Biscuits at 9:30 on a Sunday morning, in Atlanta, or Nashville, or Charlotte, or Birmingham, was that specific feeling, given a physical address. And for black families across the Southeast, across the 1980s and the 1990s, it was as reliable and as expected a part of the Sunday sequence as the service itself. The biscuit came out of the oven before 5:30 in the morning. That was when the doors opened, which tells you the operating philosophy directly. This was a restaurant built around the hours of working people, not around the hours of restaurants. Someone was in the kitchen before dawn, mixing dough from scratch, not pulling frozen rounds from a delivery box and calling it baking. The biscuit that came out was specific enough that people who grew up eating it can describe it now decades later, with a precision that has nothing to do with nostalgia, and everything to do with the fact that it was genuinely its own thing. The weight of it in your hand, the color on the top, and the softness underneath. The way it pulled apart without resistance. This was not a standard fast food biscuit. It was a made biscuit, and the difference between the two is not subtle. Jack C. Massey founded Mrs. Winners in 1979, and his qualifications for building a fried chicken chain were specific and documented. He had purchased Kentucky Fried Chicken from Colonel Harlan Sanders in the early 1960s, when the chain was still a regional operation, and he had built it into a system of 3,500 locations before selling it. He understood the fried chicken business in a detailed, operational way that most franchise founders do not. When he acquired the Grannies of Atlanta chain, 21 restaurants in the Southeast, and renamed them Mrs. Winner's Chicken and Biscuits, he was not experimenting with a concept. He was applying knowledge he had built across 2 decades to a region he understood and a customer he understood. By 1982, the chain had 64 locations. By 1984, it had 184, all of them in the Southeast, all of them serving the same menu, all of them opening before the sun came up. The menu was built to match the neighborhood it was placed in. The fried chicken was hand-breaded at each location, pressed by hand into the coating rather than run through a mechanized system, which produced a crust that had texture and held together through a drive-through bag and a car ride home without turning soft. The sides were the sides the Southeast knew: green beans, potato wedges, baked beans, macaroni. The breakfast menu ran until late morning and centered on the biscuit, dressed with chicken or steak or sausage, and accompanied by hash browns or scrambled eggs depending on what the morning required. The country fried steak was on the menu for the people who did not want chicken, and it was made with the same attention the chicken got. There was chicken pot pie. There was chicken and dumplings. The menu was the menu of a region, not the menu of a corporation imagining what a region wanted. And then there was the super cinnamon swirl, which is the item that people describe first when you ask them about Mrs. Winners, before the chicken, before the biscuit, without hesitation. A large yeast roll glazed with white frosting while it was still hot from the oven, sweet and dense, and completely its own category, with nothing comparable on any other menu in the surrounding landscape. It was not a dessert, and it was not a side. It was simply the super cinnamon swirl, and it existed at Mrs. Winners and nowhere else, and the people who ate it on Sunday mornings in their church clothes in the parking lot or in the back seat on the drive home remember it with a specificity that is the specific memory of something that cannot be replaced, because nothing replaced it. For black families across the Southeast, the Sunday sequence became its own institution over 3 decades. Church first, then Mrs. Winners. The box of chicken and the bag of biscuits in the back seat. The super cinnamon swirl that was gone before the car reached the highway. This was not a significant choice made consciously. It was the way Sunday worked, the same way the neighborhood street or the church parking lot or the route home was simply the route home. The restaurant was there, reliably, every Sunday at 9 in the morning when you needed it to be there, and it was good, and it was yours. What ended it was a sequence that began with a sale and concluded with a bankruptcy and left almost nothing standing. In 2006, Mrs. Winners was acquired by Lee's Famous Recipe Chicken, a Kentucky-based franchisor moving to consolidate the regional fried chicken market. The chain still had 113 locations at that point, spread across the Southeast, in the cities and towns where it had been a Sunday fixture for a quarter century. What the acquisition changed was not the menu, but the operational structure underneath the menu, and the 2008 recession arrived before the new ownership had stabilized anything. Sales fell. The financial structure that Lee's famous recipe had built the acquisition around did not have the cushion to absorb the decline. In 2010, Mrs. Winners filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy and closed all of its company-owned stores in a single action. 184 locations at the peak of the 1980s, 113 in 2006, and then the company's stores went dark all at once, and the parking lots that had been full on Sunday mornings for 30 years were empty. An attorney named John Butolph, who had worked as corporate counsel for the chain, purchased the trademarks and recipes in 2012 and attempted a revival, signing franchise agreements and reopening locations in Atlanta and its surrounding market. He said publicly that he received contact nearly every day from people who wanted Mrs. Winners back in their communities, which was true, and which also could not by itself solve the problem that the chain's best markets, the ones where black families had built the Sunday tradition over decades, had moved on in the years between the bankruptcy and the revival. The locations in North Carolina, which had been among the most loyal markets the chain had, closed entirely by 2024. As of late 2025, 9 locations remained, all of them clustered in the Atlanta metropolitan area, with a single outpost each, in Tennessee and Alabama. 9 locations is not a restaurant chain in any operational sense. It is the last physical evidence of something that used to exist across a wide geography. What the chain built over 30 years in the Southeast was not transferable to a new address, or a new ownership structure, or a bankruptcy reorganization. The Sunday tradition that black families had built around Mrs. Winners' parking lots across 5 states was built around specific buildings in specific neighborhoods, where the restaurant had been present long enough to become part of the rhythm of the week. When those buildings went dark in 2010, the rhythm adjusted, because rhythms always adjust, and what was there on Sunday morning after church was no longer Mrs. Winners. The biscuit recipe still exists on paper. The trademark still exists in a corporate filing somewhere in Atlanta. But the made biscuit does not come out of the oven before 5:30 in the morning in Birmingham or Charlotte or Raleigh anymore. And the parking lot that was full of people in their Sunday clothes is now whatever replaced it. Nobody got a last Sunday. Nobody knew that the Sunday they drove home with the bag on the seat was the last time that particular thing would happen. It simply stopped. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That chain gave the Southeast a Sunday morning ritual that ran for 30 years and ended in a bankruptcy filing that nobody in the parking lot caused or could have prevented. Up next, a singer who built her restaurant as a declaration of economic independence for her neighborhood, set it inside a building designed to look like a church, and watched it collapse because of a stock investigation that found nothing wrong. Section 7. Mahalia Jackson's Glory Fried Chicken Benjamin Hooks had a seat on the bench. Not a ceremonial position, not a title, a seat on the actual bench of the criminal court of Shelby County, Tennessee, making him the first black criminal court judge in the history of that state. He had earned the position through years of legal work in Memphis, had fought for it, and held it. When the people behind Mahalia Jackson's Glory Fried Chicken came to him and asked him to become president of their new restaurant company, he looked at what they were building and decided the restaurant was worth more of his time than the judgeship. He resigned from the bench in 1968 and took the job. That single decision tells you more about what Mahalia Jackson's Glory Fried Chicken was trying to be than any description of the menu, or the buildings, or the expansion strategy. A man who had a seat on the Tennessee bench looked at a fried chicken franchise aimed at black neighborhoods in American cities and concluded that this was the more important work. The chain opened its first locations in 1968 and 1969, placed deliberately in predominantly black neighborhoods in cities across the country: Memphis, Chicago, where there were eventually 5 locations, Cleveland, Detroit, Jacksonville, Dallas, Milwaukee, Tallahassee, Charlotte, Houston, and locations in the Bahamas, which tells you the ambition of the expansion even at the earliest stage. The buildings were designed by a black architect named DeBerry McKissick, and they were built to look like churches. White brick facades, peaked roof lines, structures that read from the street as permanent institutions rather than commercial tenants. The design was argument made in architecture. The restaurant was going to be on your block, and it was going to look like it intended to stay. The woman whose name was above the door understood what she was lending it to. Mahalia Jackson was born in New Orleans in 1911, raised in the church so completely that the church never left her voice or her instincts, and by the 1960s was the most celebrated gospel singer in the world. She had traveled with the civil rights movement, sung at the March on Washington, given money and time and her name to the movement for decades. She understood her name as a specific instrument with a specific weight in black communities across the country, and when she agreed to attach it to the chain, she understood that the attachment was doing something beyond marketing. She received royalties for the use of her name, but did not personally invest in the company, which matters for the story of what came later. What she contributed was the name, and in Black America in 1968, that name meant something so particular and so deep that it changed what walking through the door felt like. The civil rights leaders who appeared at the groundbreaking of the first location made the stakes explicit. Ralph David Abernathy was there. Joseph Lowery was there. They described what they were standing at as a declaration of Negro economic independence. And they meant it without irony or ceremony. The chicken was beside the point at that moment. The point was the building, the fryer, the staff, the paycheck, and the ownership structure behind all of it. The Chicago Defender, which had been reporting on Black American life, with more seriousness than almost any other publication in the country for half a century, described the operation plainly: Black-owned, managed, and staffed, hiring in the communities where it operated. Every dollar that moved through the register was supposed to stay on the block rather than flowing out to an ownership structure located somewhere else. That was the premise from the first location to the last. The chain also built something into its employment structure that distinguished it from every other fast food operation of its era. Workers received paid vacations, low-cost life insurance, major medical coverage. The company established a management school so that the people working the fryers and the counters had somewhere to go inside the organization, rather than remaining permanently at entry level. These were not symbolic gestures. In 1968 and 1969, these were extraordinary commitments, and their presence in the Mahalia Jackson operation reflects the seriousness with which Benjamin Hooks and the people around him approached what they were building. This was not a revenue machine with a famous face on the bucket. It was a structured employer with a civil rights argument embedded in the operating agreement. The menu was the menu that the neighborhoods it served already knew. Fried chicken, seasoned in the way that anyone raised in a black household in the South or the Midwest could identify before the first bite finished. Catfish, fish sandwiches, fried pies, sweet potato pie, and the Soul Bowl, which appeared on the menu as its own category, and was exactly what the name said: chicken giblets over white rice, under a pour of gravy, priced for the person who had just worked a full shift and needed something filling without calculation. The slogan the chain used in its advertising said everything it needed to say about the product's confidence in itself. It translated roughly as, "gloriously fried," and that is the gospel truth, which was not a modest claim, but not an inaccurate one either, based on what the people who ate there reported. The food historian Marcia Chatelain, writing the definitive account of fast food and Black America, places the Mahalia Jackson chain inside a specific wave of black celebrity franchise activity in the late 1960s. James Brown had gold platter restaurants. Muhammad Ali had champ burger palaces. The argument underneath all of them, as Chatelain describes it, was that integration had opened certain doors in America, while leaving wallets largely untouched, and that franchise ownership at the neighborhood level was one of the few mechanisms available for actually circulating money within black communities, rather than extracting it. The Mahalia Jackson chain was the most developed and most seriously capitalized of those attempts. It had the most cities, the most complete employee benefits package, the most organized leadership structure, and the most famous name. The Southern Foodways Alliance later documented it as the first African-American-owned franchise operation in the entire South. Not the first successful one, the first one, period, in 1968. The writer Alice Randall spent years researching the chain and spoke to people who had eaten in the original locations. None of them described the food as extraordinary, in the way people describe a restaurant that changed their understanding of what food could be. They said it was good. What they kept returning to in their descriptions was not the taste, but the feeling. The name on the bucket, the face on the sign, the person behind the counter who lived on the same block you lived on, the building that looked like a church on a street you already knew. The food was the occasion. The feeling was what people were actually consuming. Then, in 1969, the Securities and Exchange Commission announced an investigation into the franchise sales practices of John J. Hooker, the white Nashville entrepreneur, whose company Performance Systems Incorporated had invested in and partially controlled the chain, alongside its black founders. The investigation also encompassed Minnie Pearl's Chicken, a separate operation Hooker had backed, aimed at white working-class markets. The investigation found no wrongdoing. Mahalia Jackson was cleared. Benjamin Hooks was cleared. Every named party was cleared. The finding arrived too late to matter. The stock that had been trading at $40 a share during the expansion years had already fallen to 50 cents before any finding was issued. Performance Systems was effectively liquidated by the collapse. The committed capital for additional locations evaporated. By 1971, the chain was in bankruptcy, and the church-shaped white brick buildings went dark in cities from Chicago to Jacksonville, without any wrongdoing having been established against a single person connected to the enterprise. The mechanism of the collapse was located entirely outside the neighborhood. The SEC investigation, the stock price, the Nashville Entrepreneurs Company structure, none of it originated on the blocks where the locations had been built. But the consequences fell entirely on those blocks. The jobs disappeared. The management school closed. The life insurance lapsed. The medical coverage ended. A black architect's buildings went dark. The first African-American-owned franchise in the South ceased to exist because a financial structure it had been attached to, built and controlled by someone else, broke in a way that nobody on the block caused. One location survived through a Nashville operator named E.W. Mayo, who purchased the remaining rights and kept a version of the restaurant running for decades under a modified name, becoming better known eventually for fried pies than for chicken. That final outpost closed around 2008. By then, the original chain had been gone for nearly 40 years. That chain lost its footing because of a financial collapse that started somewhere entirely removed from the neighborhoods it was built to serve, and left nothing standing except one pie shop in Nashville and the memory of what the buildings were designed to look like. Up next, the restaurant in New Orleans that housed a secret meeting between freedom riders and Martin Luther King Jr. served Creole gumbo under paintings by artists who had nowhere else to display their work, and changed the law in its own dining room, one seating at a time. Section 8. Howard Johnson's and the Open Road. Your father planned the route the night before. He spread the map on the kitchen table after dinner and traced the highway with his finger, noting where the gas stations were, where the rest stops fell, and where the orange roof would appear on the horizon when you needed it. Howard Johnson's. The orange roof was the signal. It meant the car could stop, the children could eat, and no one was going to be turned away at the door, or told to go around back, or handed food through a window to take somewhere else. After 1964, when the Civil Rights Act made that legal guarantee nationwide, black families driving the American highway system filed into Howard Johnson's booths from Florida to Massachusetts and ordered fried clam strips and chicken pot pies and ice cream in flavors they had memorized because the menu was the same at every location. The consistency was the entire point. You did not have to wonder. You already knew what you were going to get, and you already knew you were going to be seated when you asked for a table. Before 1964, the picture was different, and the planning required was more serious. The Negro Motorist Green Book, published annually from 1936 through 1966 by a Harlem postal worker named Victor Green, was the document that black families used to determine where they could safely stop on any given road through any given state. Green described his publication plainly in the 1948 edition, promising that there would come a day when the guide would no longer need to be published, when black Americans could go wherever they pleased without embarrassment. He died in 1960, 4 years before that day arrived. In the meantime, the Green Book listed the hotels, restaurants, gas stations, and barbershops that would serve black travelers, organized by state, updated every year, sold at Esso stations across the country for $1.25. You literally did not leave home without it. The absence of an establishment from its pages was itself information. Howard Johnson's, for most of its peak years, was the kind of place that required the Green Book to tell you which specific locations would actually seat you. Howard Johnson's had been built from a single ice cream stand in 1925 by a Massachusetts entrepreneur named Howard Johnson, who discovered that his product was good enough to sustain a franchise operation before franchising had a name. By 1940, there were 130 Howard Johnson's restaurants on the East Coast alone. By the peak years of the 1960s and early 1970s, there were over 1,000 locations across the country, every one of them instantly recognizable by the slanted orange roof and the plate glass windows that Florida architect Rufus Mims had designed to be seen from the road before you reach the exit. The menu was standardized to a degree that was unusual for its era, built around fried clam strips, chicken pot pie, frankfurters in toasted split-top buns, and 28 flavors of ice cream that the company produced in its own plants and shipped frozen to every location. A family pulling into a Howard Johnson's in Georgia got the same clam strips as a family in Connecticut. That uniformity was the guarantee, and for black families navigating a highway system that still carried the memory of what the road had been before 1964, a reliable guarantee was worth a great deal. What Howard Johnson's had been before that guarantee existed was documented in an incident that reached the White House. In October of 1957, two men in business suits walked into a Howard Johnson's restaurant near Dover, Delaware, and ordered two 30-cent glasses of orange juice. A waitress handed them the juice in containers, wrapped to take outside, and explained that black people were not allowed to sit inside. One of the men asked to see the manager, and identified himself. He was Komla Agbeli Gbedema, the finance minister of Ghana, recently independent from British colonial rule. His companion was his American secretary. The manager heard the identification and held the policy anyway. Gbedema left the orange juice on the counter and told the manager as he walked out that this was not the last they would hear of it. He was correct. Gbedema had hosted Vice President Richard Nixon at his home in Ghana earlier that year, during Nixon's tour of Africa. He raised the Dover incident with reporters in terms that the State Department could not easily manage. If the Vice President of the United States could eat in his home in Ghana, he could not understand why he was being refused a seat at an American roadside restaurant. President Dwight Eisenhower, who had just weeks earlier sent federal troops to Little Rock to enforce school desegregation, invited Gbedema to breakfast at the White House on October 10, 1957, and apologized personally. Howard Johnson's executives issued a statement saying that segregation was not the company's policy. The Dover franchise operator kept his segregated dining room. 4 years later, in 1961, an African diplomat named William Fitzjohn was refused service at a Howard Johnson's in Hagerstown, Maryland. The State Department issued another apology. Protests organized by black activists outside Howard Johnson's locations throughout the 1960s continued until the Civil Rights Act made the legal question settled. After 1964, the relationship changed. Howard Johnson's was everywhere, it was consistent, it was reasonably priced, and it was now legally required to seat anyone who walked in. For the generation of black families who had grown up using the Green Book to plan a highway stop around the question of where they would be allowed to eat, the ability to pull into any Howard Johnson's on any highway in any state and know the answer in advance was not a small thing. It was the specific freedom the Civil Rights Act had promised, made concrete in a booth with a Formica table and 28 flavors of ice cream. The orange roof became a family landmark. Your father had seen it on the map the night before. It appeared on the horizon, where he said it would appear. Howard Johnson's declined for reasons that had nothing to do with any of that history. The rise of fast food through the 1970s pulled the highway dining customer toward McDonald's and Burger King, which were faster and cheaper than a full sit-down menu. When Howard Johnson Sr. passed control of the company to his son Howard B. Johnson in 1959, the younger Johnson managed the chain through its peak and sold it in 1980 for $630 million. The buyers lacked the founder's feel for the business, and the chain moved through a series of ownership changes across the following decades without finding a stable footing. Locations closed through the 1980s and 1990s in numbers that the chain could not replenish with new openings. By the turn of the century, what had been 1,000 locations was down to a handful. The last Howard Johnson's restaurant in Lake George, New York, closed in 2022, ending 97 years of operation with no announcement and very little notice. What ended with it was a very specific chapter of Black family travel history. The chapter in which a restaurant chain that had once required a federal apology to an African head of state became, after the law changed, a reliable orange roof on the horizon that meant the car could stop and everyone inside it would be fed. Your father knew where it would appear on the route because he had checked the map the night before. That was simply how the trip worked. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That restaurant went from requiring a presidential apology after turning away a foreign finance minister to becoming the orange roof on the highway that Black families planned their road trips around, and then disappeared so quietly that most people missed the final closing entirely. Up next, a neighborhood institution in Memphis that survived integration, the crack epidemic, and 5 decades of change, and where Martin Luther King Jr. ate his last meal before leaving for the Lorraine Motel. Section 9. The Four-Way, Memphis. The pool hall was next door. You could hear it through the wall when the restaurant was quiet, the crack of the brake, and the low voices of the men running the table. The sounds of a South Memphis afternoon in a neighborhood that had built its own world on Mississippi Boulevard because the rest of Memphis had made clear that was what was required. Irene and Clint Cleaves had opened the Four-Way Grill in 1946 at the corner of Mississippi and Walker, right up against the pool hall, and Irene had seen immediately that the two businesses could sustain each other. She made sandwiches in the kitchen and sent them through to the men playing pool next door. And the men playing pool next door became the first regulars of a restaurant that would go on to feed civil rights leaders, Stax Records musicians, Rosa Parks, Aretha Franklin, B.B. King, and a Baptist minister from Atlanta who played pool himself when the marching was done for the day and who ordered the fried catfish and peach cobbler every time he came in. The name came from the corner, Four Ways, the intersection of Mississippi and Walker in the heart of Soulsville, which was its real name and had been since before the Cleaves opened anything on the block. Clint Cleaves had worked for years as the personal chauffeur to Memphis Mayor E.H. Crump, which gave him a particular kind of standing in a city whose racial arrangements were enforced with violence and with law, and that standing translated into something specific for the restaurant. The Four-Way was, from its earliest years, naturally integrated in a city where integration was neither natural nor legal, and it held that quality not through confrontation, but through the specific authority that the Cleaves brought to the room. The current owners describe it plainly. In a segregated time, this place was never segregated because of the warm arms of Mrs. Cleaves and Mr. Cleaves and the help of Mayor Crump. That combination of personal force and political connection created a space that functioned outside the ordinary rules of Memphis for 30 years before the law caught up to what the Four-Way had already been doing on its corner. The restaurant started as a tiny counter inside the pool hall with an adjacent barbershop and grew. By the height of the civil rights era in the 1960s, the Four-Way had a full dining room and a private room in the back, and the dining room had white tablecloths and waiters dressed in white, which was an uncommonly formal arrangement for a soul food restaurant and a deliberate one. You rang a bell and were led to your table. The food that arrived was the food of South Memphis, and the Deep South that had produced everyone in that dining room. Fried catfish, peach cobbler, turkey and dressing, yams, turnip greens, pinto beans, cornbread, smothered pork chops, stewed neck bones, with a daily special that corresponded to the day of the week. Grammy-winning songwriter David Porter, who worked at Stax Records a few blocks up the street and wrote "Hold On I'm Comin'" and Soul Man, described the Four-Way in one sentence. It was the signature place for all of us artists to dine. Otis Redding ate there. Carla Thomas ate there. Booker T and the MGs. The musicians who were making the records that were about to define American music walked from the Stax studio up Mississippi Boulevard to the Four-Way when the session was done and ate off the same menu in the same dining room as the civil rights leaders who were planning the marches that were going to define American law. Martin Luther King Jr. came through Memphis multiple times in the years when the sanitation workers' strike was building toward its crisis, and he came to the Four-Way each time. Jerry Thompson, who married into the family that now owns the restaurant and serves as its unofficial historian, states that King's last meal was at the Four-Way. His favorites were the fried catfish and the peach cobbler, both of which appear on the menu today, in the same form they appeared in then. Between meals, King played pool in the hall next door. There are photographs of him at the table, shooting with the cue behind his back, which is not a beginner's position. Mrs. Cleves was very adamant, Thompson says in describing her attitude toward King's visits, about making sure he had a place that gave him a refuge where he could recharge his batteries and just relax. The Four-Way was that place in Memphis. Not a headquarters, not a press event, not a march. A corner booth and a plate of catfish, and the sounds of the pool hall coming through the wall. King was shot at the Lorraine Motel on April 4, 1968. He had been in Memphis to support the sanitation workers who had been on strike since February, and he had delivered his speech at Mason Temple on the evening of April 3rd, the speech that ended with his statement that he had been to the mountaintop. The next afternoon he was gone. For Memphis, for South Memphis, for the block around the Four-Way, the assassination was the beginning of a long decline that the restaurant had to outlast if it was going to survive at all. Clint Cleves died in 1970. Irene kept the Four-Way running by herself for more than 2 decades after that, sustained by the neighborhood and by the force of her own reputation, feeding Soulsville through the heroin years and the crack years, and the years when the Memphis economy contracted and the manufacturing jobs left, and the neighborhood around the restaurant emptied of the middle-class black families who had built it. By 1996, Irene was ill and could no longer run the kitchen the way she had for 50 years. The restaurant stumbled. Irene Cleves died in 1998, and the Four-Way, after more than half a century at the corner of Mississippi and Walker, closed. It sat shuttered for a few years, and those years are their own part of the story. A neighborhood institution that closes does not disappear the moment the door locks. It disappears slowly, as the people who remember it stop being able to point to it and say, "That is the place," as the building begins to take on the look of a building that has been left, rather than a building that is waiting. The corner of Mississippi and Walker in South Memphis in the late 1990s already looked like a neighborhood that had been left by the forces that had shaped it. The Four-Way sitting dark on that corner was one more signal that the world that had made the restaurant was receding. In 2001, a man named Willie Early Bates purchased the property and began the work of reopening it. Bates had grown up a few blocks from the Four-Way, had delivered newspapers in the neighborhood as a boy, pushing his deliveries around the corner in a red wagon. He had grown up eating Irene Cleves's food and had loved it the way you love food that arrives at the exact moment of your life when food forms your understanding of what good means. He had no restaurant experience. He had a childhood memory and a belief that the corner of Mississippi and Walker needed what it had always had. The red wagon he used as a boy is still at the restaurant. Patrice Bates Thompson, Willie's daughter, who grew up in the neighborhood and now runs the Four-Way with her mother Jo Ellen, keeps the wagon at the corner as the specific physical memory of why her father bought the building. The Four-Way is still open at 998 Mississippi Boulevard, still serving fried catfish and peach cobbler, and the daily specials that rotate through the week, the way they did when Mrs. Cleves designed the menu. Drake filmed a music video in the dining room. Google produced a 90-second commercial about the restaurant during Black History Month in 2021 that was viewed nearly 1 million times. The James Beard Foundation has recognized it. The photographs on the walls show everyone who has passed through the dining room across 8 decades: the musicians, the activists, the presidents, and the neighborhood people who came in, not because the restaurant was famous, but because it was theirs. What has disappeared is not the building, or the food, or the family's commitment to keeping both. What has disappeared is the Soulsville around it, the density of the black community that filled the blocks between the Four-Way and Stax, and beyond in the 1950s and 1960s, the pool hall that shared its wall, the neighborhood that produced the people who filled the dining room and rang the bell and were led to a white-clothed table. Memphis, as one food writer put it after visiting the corner, bears a dull coat from the outside. Rusted abandoned buildings, overgrown lots, as though after the assassination, nothing was quite the same. The Four-Way is still on the corner. The corner is not the same corner it was. That restaurant kept its doors open through assassination, epidemic, closure, and revival, and held the corner through everything that South Memphis went through in 80 years. Up next, a Chicago institution that served the South Side for decades, that hosted the after-party when Muhammad Ali won back his title, and that closed the week its owner was murdered in the parking lot. Section 10. Army and Lou's, Chicago Pran. The tablecloths were red linen. That detail mattered more than you might expect, because for many black families on the south side of Chicago in the 1950s and into the 1960s, Army and Lou's at 422 East 75th Street was the first restaurant that had ever laid a red linen tablecloth in front of them. Not a paper placemat, not a formica surface wiped down between customers, not a counter where you stood, a tablecloth, napkins, waiters, live jazz on Friday and Saturday evenings, coming from wherever the musicians had set up in the room, the music moving through the dining space, the way music moves through a room when it is actually in the room and not coming through a speaker. The restaurant critic and writer who described Army and Lou's in its final years reached for the word fine dining, and that was the accurate word. For 65 years, the South Side had a fine dining establishment that was theirs. William and Louvilla Armstrong opened the restaurant in 1945 at the corner of 75th and Cottage Grove, in the heart of the Chatham neighborhood. William was Army, and Louvilla was Lou, which is how the name worked, and the restaurant they opened was a soul food institution in the specific sense that the institution came first, and the term soul food arrived later, to describe what the restaurant had already been doing. Chitterlings prepared properly, which requires patience and knowledge that cannot be improvised. Fried chicken, catfish, baby back ribs, Creole shrimp, greens with smoked ham hock, which is a specific thing and not the same as greens prepared any other way, the pot liquor carrying the pork through every leaf so that what you tasted was both things at once. Chicken gumbo soup, peach cobbler made from scratch, red beans and rice. The menu was the menu of the Great Migration, made into an institution, the food that had traveled north from the deep south in the luggage, and the memory of the families who packed the South Side neighborhood by neighborhood across the 1940s and 1950s. And Army and Lou's put it on a table, covered with a red linen cloth, and served it with live jazz. The Chicago Defender, which had been covering black life on the South Side for decades with the seriousness it deserved, placed Army and Lou's in the category of the oldest black-owned restaurant in the Midwest, which was a title the restaurant held for most of its existence. Families came for graduations, birthdays, and anniversaries in the private room in the back, celebrations that required a room that would take the occasion seriously. The waitress Betty Martin, who worked the dining room for so many years that she became a landmark of the restaurant herself, knew regulars by name and by order. A table reserved for a birthday arrived already understanding what the birthday required. That was not restaurant service in the way a corporation trains it. That was the specific knowledge that comes from decades of feeding the same neighborhood. Mayor Harold Washington discovered Army and Lou's sometime after his election in 1983, which made him Chicago's first black mayor, a fact that the South Side understood as something larger than a municipal achievement, and he came back so consistently that the staff stopped treating his arrival as unusual. He ate there up to 3 times a week. He was partial to just about everything on the menu, longtime staff recalled after his death. Washington died on November 25, 1987, of a heart attack at his desk in City Hall, and the grief on the South Side had a specific character, because Washington had been more than a mayor to those blocks. He had been the specific proof that the South Side's political weight could move an entire city. Army and Lou's served the neighborhood through that grief, the way it had served it through everything else, by being open and by having the food ready. Martin Luther King Jr. had come through the dining room in the 1960s, when the movement was working the Chicago streets, and the housing inequality that King described as the most vicious discrimination he had encountered anywhere in the country. Muhammad Ali came, Cab Calloway came, James Brown came, Smokey Robinson. These were not promotional visits or charity appearances. They were people who came to the South Side because the South Side was where they had business, or where people they respected had directed them. And Army and Lou's was where you ate when you were on that part of 75th Street and knew anything at all about the neighborhood. In 1973, William and Louvilla Armstrong sold the restaurant to Charles and Mary Cole, who ran it for 14 years before retiring in 1987 and selling to the next owners. In October of 1994, one of those owners let a former employee into the restaurant after closing. The man had been fired. He came back, and he murdered the owner at his desk, took the contents of the safe, and left. The owner's wife and daughter, concerned when he did not come home, came to the restaurant to look for him and found him. That is the part of Army and Lou's history that does not appear on the menu, or in the award citations, or in the accounts of the famous people who filled the booths. A man who had been running a neighborhood institution was murdered inside it by someone he had trusted enough to let in after the doors had locked. The restaurant did not close. It reopened under Dolores Reynolds, who became the principal owner and ran it for the next 17 years. And the dining room with the red tablecloths and the live jazz continued serving the South Side through the 1990s and the 2000s, the way it had since 1945. Reynolds added Friday jazz nights and a first Sunday brunch, and the regulars kept coming, and the alderman whose ward office was down the street ordered from the kitchen regularly, and Army and Lou's continued to be the specific thing it had always been, a fine dining establishment on the South Side that treated the neighborhood as though the neighborhood deserved that. What finally closed it was the recession of 2008, which hit the South Side the way recessions hit neighborhoods that do not have the financial cushion to absorb a sustained drop in revenue. By the middle of 2010, the monthly foot traffic at Army and Lou's had dropped from 1,500 customers to 750. Reynolds and her partners watched the numbers and tried to wait out the decline, cutting costs, maintaining the menu, hoping the foot traffic would recover. It did not recover. On January 30th, 2011, Army and Lou's served its last meal and closed its doors. 30 part-time workers lost their jobs. The alderman said she hoped they would reopen. The people who gathered at the barbershop across the street said they had the best greens in the city, and it was a shame to see them go. A mayoral candidate said it was important for the city to find ways to support its small businesses, and many of them were drowning. Reynolds said they hoped to reopen eventually. The outgoing voicemail message said that restaurant operations had been put on hold, but catering was still available. 65 years of red tablecloths and live jazz, and graduations in the private room, and Harold Washington eating there 3 times a week, reduced to a voicemail message about catering availability. What Army and Lou's had been for 65 years was the specific thing that its founders understood was missing from the South Side in 1945, and that they built to fill: a fine dining establishment where black families on the South Side could take their children for the first time and show them that a tablecloth and a napkin and a waiter who knew your name were things they were entitled to. Not a novelty, not a luxury destination you drove to from somewhere else. A neighborhood restaurant that happened to have red linen on every table, and musicians in the corner on Friday nights. That was simply the standard it held for 65 years. And when it closed in January 2011, nobody opened anything to replace it on East 75th Street. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That restaurant held a standard for 65 years that the neighborhood built its sense of itself around, and when it closed, because the economy contracted, there was nothing on the block that could step into what it had been. Up next, a restaurant that operated out of a converted Dairy Queen in a city that had burned its own neighborhood to the ground, and that became the only place in town where the people who had lost everything could still get a plate of food that tasted like home. Section 11. The Restaurants of Black Wall Street, Tulsa. There are brass markers embedded in the sidewalk now. You walk along North Greenwood Avenue in Tulsa today, and you look down and find them set into the concrete at building after building. Small plaques that say what stood on each spot before May 31st, 1921. The markers note the name of the business or building, the year it was destroyed, and in some cases the year it was rebuilt. They are precise, and they are quiet, and they are the most honest accounting of what happened on that street, because the buildings themselves are gone, and what replaced them cannot tell you what was there before. The markers can. They are the only remaining physical record of a restaurant district that was among the most developed black commercial neighborhoods in the country, and that was burned to the ground in a single night by a white mob while the city of Tulsa watched. The Greenwood District sat on the north side of Tulsa, Oklahoma, in a self-contained neighborhood that the city's rigid segregation had, with characteristic irony, made into something extraordinary. Because black residents of Tulsa were barred from white-owned businesses, white neighborhoods, white schools, and white commercial districts, they built their own. They built it from the ground up, block by block, beginning in the early 1900s, until by 1921, the 35 square blocks of the Greenwood District contained the highest concentration of black-owned businesses in the United States. Newspapers documented and compared it favorably to Beale Street in Memphis and State Street in Chicago. Booker T. Washington visited and named it Black Wall Street, and the name held because it was accurate, a functioning economic ecosystem, entirely self-sustaining, built not from wealth or advantage but from the specific necessity of a community that had no other option. The restaurants were the daily infrastructure of that world. Across the 8 years preceding the massacre, a food historian, counting the establishments from city business directories, found approximately 30 cafes on North Greenwood Avenue alone, 15 on East Archer, and another 24 scattered across adjacent streets. That is close to 70 restaurants operating in a 35-block radius before 1921. Most priced their plated hot dinners at 25 cents, which was the price point for working people who needed a meal they could afford, on the wages Tulsa was paying. Many were open day and night. Their advertising in the Tulsa Star, the community's black newspaper, stressed cleanliness, which was both a genuine operating standard and a pointed response to the assumption that black-owned establishments would not maintain one. The restaurants had names that tell you something about who was running them. Most went by their owners' names, but others had names that declared something about what they intended to offer. The Busy Bee, the Cozy Corner, the Crystal, the Liberty, the Red Rose, the Square Deal, the Sunny Side. These were not neutral choices. They were names that said the people who ate here deserved something good, something fair, something worth coming back to. The Square Deal, in particular, carries a weight in that context that goes beyond the plate of food. Savannah Elliott, born in Texas, ran the Busy Bee Cafe on North Greenwood and had become so reliably present in the neighborhood by 1918 that the Tulsa Star described her hosting birthday dinners for groups of up to 17 people. She was known as Mother Elliott, despite being in her 30s. Susie Bell ran another cafe on the avenue, and in 1920 the Waffle House next door to her caught fire and damaged her building, and she went out the next morning before the sun was up looking for a new location, certain she would be back in service by evening. Her regulars counted on her to provide their daily meals. She found her new space and she opened it, and her regulars came back. Her cafe was destroyed in the massacre. On the night of May 31, 1921, a white mob moved through the Greenwood district and burned it. The immediate pretext was an accusation against a black shoe shiner named Dick Rowland, who had been accused of assaulting a white elevator operator in a downtown building. The accusation was sensationalized by the Tulsa Tribune. By the night of May 31st, the mob had armed itself. Oklahoma National Guard units joined or stood aside. Airplanes flew over the district. Between May 31st and June 1, between 75 and 300 black Tulsans were killed. 10,000 were left homeless. Property damage in 1921 dollars exceeded $1.5 million in real estate alone, a figure that translates to more than $40 million in 2025. Every restaurant on North Greenwood, every cafe on East Archer, the Busy Bee, the Red Rose, the Square Deal, Susie Bell's rebuilt cafe, all of it gone in a single night. The insurance companies refused to pay claims. The city of Tulsa refused to compensate anyone. White political and business leaders moved immediately to prevent reconstruction, proposing rezoning laws that would have made it impossible to rebuild the residential and commercial structures on the same footprints. The residents fought the rezoning and won on procedural grounds. And then they did something that the people who burned the district had apparently not anticipated. They rebuilt it. By 1922, most of the homes had been reconstructed. By 1942, the Greenwood District had 242 black-owned and black-operated business establishments, which was more than had existed before the massacre. Restaurants reopened. Cafes opened in new buildings on the same blocks. The 25-cent dinner came back to North Greenwood. What finally ended the rebuilt district was not another massacre. What ended it was desegregation. When the Civil Rights Act of 1964 made it legal for black residents of Tulsa to eat, shop, and conduct business anywhere in the city, many of them did. The neighborhood restaurants and cafes that had thrived, specifically because there was nowhere else to go, lost their captive community. Black families who had eaten on North Greenwood every week because the rest of Tulsa was closed to them could now eat on the rest of Tulsa, and some of them did. And the commercial ecosystem of Greenwood that had survived a massacre and rebuilt itself from nothing began to thin for reasons that had nothing to do with violence. Urban renewal finished what desegregation had started. In the 1960s and 1970s, Tulsa built a freeway through the Greenwood district. The same urban renewal strategy that was deployed against black neighborhoods in cities across the country in those decades, cutting the community in half and removing blocks of businesses and homes that had stood since the rebuilding. The combination of desegregation drawing residents outward and urban renewal physically destroying what remained left the Greenwood district a fraction of what it had been either before 1921 or in the rebuilt years that followed. What stands on North Greenwood today is a small cluster of historic buildings from the rebuilding era, a museum called Greenwood Rising that opened in 2021 on the centennial of the massacre, and the brass markers in the sidewalk. Walk the block and you find them. This building, destroyed 1921, rebuilt. That building, destroyed 1921, not rebuilt. The markers do not describe what the buildings contained, or who ran them, or what 25 cents bought you in the Busy Bee, or the Red Rose, or the Square Deal on a Tuesday evening in 1920 when the neighborhood was fully alive. You have to find that in the archives of the Tulsa Star, in the city's business directories, in the work of food historians who counted the cafes one by one, from the listings marked with a small letter C, the Jim Crow directory's notation that the establishment served colored customers. That letter C is the only record that many of those restaurants existed at all. The food they served, the people who ate it, the names of the owners who went out before dawn looking for a new location after the fire next door destroyed their building. All of it is in those archives, and nowhere else. Susie Bell found her new space. She opened by evening. Her regulars came back. And then 1 year later, everything was gone. And she is in the record only because a newspaper noted that she had entertained a birthday party of 17. Those restaurants were built from nothing, survived a massacre, were rebuilt from nothing again, and were finally undone not by violence the second time, but by the very freedom they had spent decades being denied. Up next, a New Orleans restaurant where an entire kitchen culture was taught by one woman to 3 generations of chefs who went on to define American cooking, and where the recipes walked out the door when she did. Section 12, Willie Mae's Scotch House, New Orleans. She was 89 years old and still frying the chicken herself. Just before Hurricane Katrina arrived in 2005, that was the arrangement at the corner of St. Anne and North Tonty Streets in New Orleans' Treme neighborhood. Willie Mae Seaton, born 1916 in Crystal Springs, Mississippi, standing at the stove in the kitchen of a restaurant that seated 28 people at maximum capacity, frying chicken to a stunning crisp, seasoning red beans with garlic and pickle tips, simmering okra and tomato into a summer gumbo, while her son Charles and her granddaughter Carrie managed the dining room. She had been cooking in that building for more than 30 years by then. She had been in the building itself for nearly 50. 28 seats. The woman whose name was on the door, at 89, was the one doing the cooking. Nobody had yet told her this was unusual, or if they had, she had not found the observation interesting. Willie Mae Seaton had moved to New Orleans from Mississippi during the Second World War, when her husband found work at the Higgins Industries shipyard that was building landing craft for the Allied invasion of Europe. She opened a beauty shop on the corner of St. Anne and North Tonty, which she ran until 1957, when she converted the space into a bar. The house drink was scotch and milk, which is how the establishment got its name. The bar shared the building with a barber shop and the remaining beauty salon, and Seaton began cooking in the back kitchen for her regulars, because her regulars were hungry, and she could cook. The food she prepared was the food she had grown up with in Crystal Springs, adapted to what New Orleans offered. Fried chicken, white beans, pork chops, red beans seasoned in a way that was specific to her, and not to anyone else. The smell of it moved through the building and out onto the street, and the people on the street followed it in. In the early 1970s, the beauty salon closed, which opened more of the building to the restaurant, and Willie Mae's Scotch House became what it would remain for the next 3 decades. A neighborhood joint in the Treme with a maximum of 28 seats, a menu built on chicken and beans, and whatever the kitchen felt like making that day, and a proprietor who knew every regular by name and by what they would order before they sat down. This was not a restaurant that was working toward recognition. It was a restaurant that was working toward the next plate of food. Seton told the Southern Foodways Alliance, which documented her restaurant as part of its ongoing archive of Southern food culture, that she did not like a big restaurant. 28 seats was the right number. She could see every table from the kitchen. For decades, the restaurant existed in the specific obscurity of things that are genuinely excellent and entirely local, known to the Treme neighborhood, known to certain chefs and food writers who had been pointed there by someone who knew, unknown to the wider city, and completely unknown outside New Orleans. The fried chicken was what people described when they described Willie Mae's. The crust had a color and a texture that was specific to her technique and her oil temperature and her timing, and these are not separable things. They are a single knowledge that lives in the hands and the eyes of the person who has done it 10,000 times. Food writers who ate the chicken at Willie Mae's used words like revelatory and transcendent, which are words that get applied to food fairly cheaply in restaurant criticism, but that people who ate at Willie Mae's applied with genuine intent. The chicken was that specific thing. In May of 2005, the James Beard Foundation awarded Willie Mae's Scotch House the America's Classic Restaurant designation for the Southern region, which is the foundation's recognition of restaurants that serve quality food that reflects the character of their communities. It is the recognition that matters most for the category of restaurant Willie Mae's had always been, a neighborhood institution whose excellence had never required outside confirmation, but whose excellence deserved it anyway. The award brought national attention to a corner of the Treme that most of the country had never heard of. Journalists and food writers made the trip. The 28 seats were suddenly not enough for the demand. Months later, the levees failed. Hurricane Katrina flooded the restaurant in August of 2005. The building at St. Anne and North Tonty sustained significant damage, and the neighborhood around it, which was the Treme, one of the oldest black neighborhoods in North America, sustained the kind of damage that takes years to assess and longer to recover from. Willie Mae Seton was 89 years old. The restaurant that had been her life's work for nearly 5 decades was flooded and gutted. The James Beard Foundation had just told the country it was worth finding, and the country had not yet finished finding it before the water came. The Southern Foodways Alliance organized a national fundraising campaign to rebuild the restaurant. Chef John Currence, a New Orleans native who had built his career in Oxford, Mississippi, led a volunteer effort of chefs who came to the Treme to do the physical work of reconstruction. The story of chefs from across the country traveling to New Orleans to help rebuild a 28-seat neighborhood restaurant run by a 90-year-old woman was the kind of story that the food world understood as a reckoning with something important. That the restaurants which defined what American cooking actually was, as opposed to what American cooking told itself it was, were often places like this one, on corners like this one, run by people whose names appeared on no culinary school curriculum. The 1978 book Creole Feast, written by chef Nathaniel Burton and oral historian Rudy Lombard, had made this argument explicitly and documentably. The creators of New Orleans Creole haute cuisine, the people behind the dishes served at Galatoire's, Broussard's, the Caribbean Room, and the other restaurants that defined the city's culinary reputation internationally, were almost without exception African American. Black chefs and black cooks had built the cuisine that white-owned fine dining establishments presented to the world as their own product. The recognition went one direction, the labor went the other. Willie Mae Seton's restaurant, on its corner in the Treme, was the specific inversion of that arrangement. A black woman cooking the food she had always cooked, in a building she controlled, for a neighborhood that knew her. The restaurant reopened in 2007. Willie Mae Seton was 91 years old. She continued to cook. Barack Obama stopped at the restaurant in August of 2015, the 10th anniversary of Katrina, for lunch. He sat in one of the 28 seats. The photographs from that visit show an unremarkable dining room in a converted double shotgun house on a corner in the Treme, with framed awards on the wall and a plate of fried chicken on the table. Willie Mae Seton died in September of 2015 at the age of 99. Her granddaughter Carrie Seton Stewart took over the restaurant. What died with her was not the recipe in any simple sense. The family has the recipe. They have made the chicken thousands of times since 2015. What died with her was the specific knowledge that is not transferable through a written recipe or a verbal instruction. The knowledge that lives in the hands of the person who has done a thing so many times that the thing becomes instinct rather than procedure. The oil temperature at which her eye told her the chicken was ready. The timing that she did not count but felt. The way she seasoned the beans that the recipe describes but cannot fully account for. Cookbook author Leah Chase, who ran Dookie Chases across town, described cooking as something that could be written down but could never be fully explained, that the difference between a recipe and the food was the cook. Willie Mae Seton was that difference. The original building on St. Anne Street caught fire in 2024, forcing the family to relocate operations to a new downtown location while the original was assessed. A new Willie Mae's opened on Baran Street in November of 2024, a modern space significantly different from the 28-seat corner joint in the Treme. The food is still called Willie Mae's, the chicken is still fried. Whether the knowledge is intact is a question that only the chicken can answer, and the chicken cannot speak. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That restaurant survived flood and fire and outlasted its founder by a decade. But the question of what remains when the person who built something is gone is one that no reopening can fully answer. Up next, a chain that served the American South for 40 years and then became infamous for the largest racial discrimination settlement in United States history, paid out to the people who had been eating there every Sunday for a generation. Section 13, Shoney's Sunday Morning at Shoney's, had a specific order to it. You drove in from church, still in your good clothes, and you took a booth, and someone brought you a menu you already knew by heart, and after a certain number of visits, you stopped looking at the menu for the breakfast bar, because the breakfast bar was always the same, and always the reason you were there. Hot biscuits in a warming tray, scrambled eggs, bacon and sausage links under the heat lamp, gravy in a crockery dish, country ham if the location had it. The plates were heavy, and the booths were built to hold a family, and on Sunday mornings, across the American South, from the 1960s through the 1990s, black families filled those booths in numbers that the chain's own marketing acknowledged and celebrated. Shoney's called itself America's Dinner Table. On Sunday mornings in Georgia and Tennessee and Alabama and the Carolinas and Virginia, the table was set, and you sat down at it, and you filled your plate, and you stayed as long as you needed. The chain had started modestly. Alex Schoenbaum opened the Parkette Drive-In in Charleston, West Virginia in 1947, next to his father's bowling alley. He became a big boy franchise operator in 1952, renamed his locations Shoney's Big Boy, and began building out across the Upper South. The expansion that turned Shoney's into a regional institution came from a different man. Raymond Danner had grown up in Louisville in difficult circumstances, sold vending machines in the late 1950s, noticed how busy the big boy drive-ins were, and bought the Nashville franchise from Schoenbaum in 1959 for $1,000. He opened one location in Madison, a Nashville suburb, then 4 more by 1961, then 7 by the time he bought out his original partner. By 1966, he had 10 restaurants. By the time he was done, he had built a company generating more than $1 billion a year in annual revenue, and Shoney's had become one of the most recognizable dining destinations in the South, with more than 1,500 locations spread across a region that treated it as a reliable fixture the way it treated church and the filling station as reliable fixtures. The breakfast bar was what made Sunday work. The strawberry pie in the glass case by the entrance, layered with cream and fresh strawberries, was what made everything else possible to wait for. The hot bar at lunch and dinner offered the kind of food that did not require any explanation to the people eating it. Pot roast, macaroni and cheese, fried catfish on Fridays, collard greens at some locations, corn on the cob in summer. The price point was designed to accommodate a family without requiring a budget calculation in the parking lot. The booths were designed to accommodate 4 to 6 people, with room for coats and bags, and the general physical reality of feeding children in a public space, without anyone being made to feel that the space was not for them. Shoney's built its customer base on the specific promise of a restaurant that would accommodate a family that arrived hungry and did not want to be rushed out. Black families across the South kept that promise funded. They came on Sundays after church, and on weekday evenings, and on Saturday afternoons, and on the occasions that required a table big enough for everyone. They came because the food was good and affordable, and because Shoney's was there, on the highway and on the town road, and in the strip mall, with reliable hours and a consistent menu. The chain's own internal data confirmed what the full parking lots made visible. Black customers represented a significant portion of the revenue at locations across the South. Inside those same locations, across the same years, the chain's leadership was running a systematic operation to ensure that the black customers eating in the front dining room did not encounter black employees doing anything other than kitchen work invisible to them at the back. Ray Danner's management philosophy, as documented in depositions taken during the lawsuit that would eventually define his legacy, was expressed in language he apparently did not bother to obscure. When he visited a restaurant and found what he considered too many black employees visible to customers, he told the manager the restaurant was too cloudy and needed to be lightened up. A white manager in Prattville, Alabama, described Danner making this instruction personally. Another former employee testified that Danner offered to match any employee's contribution to the Ku Klux Klan. A senior manager described being told by Danner, in direct language, that he did not want black people visible in his restaurants. These are not contested characterizations. They are statements from depositions filed in federal court. The numbers documented what the instructions produced. By 1989, black workers made up 38.6% of Shoney's kitchen staff, the jobs out of customer sight. They made up 8.4% of servers, the customer-facing jobs. They held 3.7% of mid-level manager and trainee positions. They held 1.8% of the manager positions. The chain was extracting labor from black workers in the kitchen while blocking their advancement toward any role a customer might see. In April 1989, a group of plaintiffs that eventually included 5 black employees and 4 white managers who had been fired for refusing to comply with the racial policies filed a class action lawsuit in federal court in Pensacola, Florida. The white managers, Billy and Henry Elliott, had been terminated in April 1988. When they declined to reduce their black employees in compliance with Danner's instructions. They took their case to a lawyer named Tommy Warren. The NACO Legal Defense and Educational Fund joined the case. The class eventually encompassed approximately 40,000 black employees and job applicants who had been affected by Shoney's hiring policies between February 1985 and November 1992. The lawsuit made its way through the federal courts, while the chain continued operating. At the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which had jurisdiction over employment discrimination claims, the case languished for years under a leadership that did not prioritize it. The class of injured parties kept growing. Danner, in his own deposition, confirmed his philosophy in the careful language of a man who knew he was being recorded. He stated that he had on occasion given his opinion that a possible problem area was that a specific store had too many black employees as compared to the racial mix of the geographical area served by the store. The depositions from the people who had worked under him were less careful in their language about what he had actually said in rooms where no stenographer was present. On January 25, 1993, a federal judge in Pensacola approved a settlement of $132.5 million. The largest racial discrimination settlement against a private employer in United States history at the time. Danner surrendered $65 million in Shoney's stock and resigned from the board. The company did not admit wrongdoing. The settlement required an affirmative action program covering hiring and promotion over the following 10 years. An estimated 10,000 claimants received payments, with some original plaintiffs receiving as much as $100,000 each. Danner subsequently became a life member of the NACOP, a development that the record notes without further editorial comment. The settlement did not save the chain in any operational sense. The combination of the settlement costs, which produced a $77.2 million charge against 1992 earnings, and the debt Shoney's had accumulated through aggressive expansion in the 1980s, totaling approximately $255 million by the mid-decade, produced a financial structure that could not absorb normal competitive pressure. Cracker Barrel and Waffle House and IHOP, and eventually the breakfast-focused extensions of McDonald's and Wendy's pulled the morning customer. Same-store sales declined through the 1990s. The chain that had operated more than 1,500 locations filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in 2005. As of 2025, Shoney's operates approximately 50 to 60 locations, concentrated in a handful of southern states. From 1,500 locations to 50 is not a decline. It is an almost complete disappearance that has taken place without most people noticing, because the chain that did the disappearing was not doing it all at once, but one closing at a time, one parking lot going dark at a time, one Sunday morning tradition ending without announcement. What black families were eating at on those Sunday mornings, through all of those decades, was a chain whose most senior leadership held them in contempt, while taking their money and keeping their faces away from the jobs the money supported. The biscuits were real. The strawberry pie was real. The booth that fit the whole family was real. The Sunday morning ritual built around all of it was real. What was also real, and simultaneous, and invisible to the people in the booths, was the policy operating in the kitchen and in the hiring office on the other side of the same building. That chain took the Sunday morning loyalty of black families across the South for 40 years, while running a documented operation to keep black workers out of any job those families might see. Up next, the last section, and a thread that runs through everything on this list, quieter than any single restaurant, and harder to name than any one address. Section 14, the room that was yours. Start with what choosing a restaurant used to mean. Before 1964, in most of the American South, and in many parts of the North that did not advertise their policies as clearly, walking into a restaurant you did not already know was a calculation. You were calculating whether you would be seated, whether your order would be taken, whether what arrived at your table would be equal to what arrived at the table next to yours, whether the experience of eating there would cost you something beyond the price of the meal. The calculation was so ordinary, so built into the texture of daily life, that the people who made it every time they left the house did not necessarily experience it as a calculation at all. They simply knew which places were theirs and which were not, the way you know which streets are safe and which are not, without having to consult a list. The restaurants on this list existed because of that calculation. Every one of them, whether it was a 28-seat bar in the Treme that started serving food because the regulars were hungry, or a church-shaped building on a block in Chicago that was built to look like it intended to stay, or a white cloth dining room on West Hunter Street in Atlanta where a man could bring his family and know that the table would be set properly, was an answer to the same underlying condition. Black Americans needed a place where the calculation came back in their favor before they walked in the door. These restaurants were that place. What they became was something larger than the need they were built to fill. Food historian Andrea Smith has described black-owned restaurants of the civil rights era as a covert network of public spaces hidden in plain sight. On the outside, people were going in to gather around gumbo or pork chops. Inside, they were planning one of the most important social movements in American history. Pascal's Restaurant on West Hunter Street in Atlanta was where the logistics of the March on Washington were worked out over plates of food. Dooky Chase's in New Orleans was where Leah Chase seated black and white organizers together at white cloth tables during years when that was against the law, and kept doing it because stopping it would have required more political capital than the city wanted to spend on one dining room. The Four-Way in Memphis had a pool hall next door where a man from Atlanta played pool with the queue behind his back between the marches that would cost him his life. Army and Lou's on East 75th Street in Chicago fed Harold Washington 3 times a week, not because the mayor had nowhere else to eat, but because that dining room was where the South Side's political weight gathered and took stock of itself. The food in all of these rooms was also simply good. Willie Mae Seaton's fried chicken at the Scotch House was described by food writers with words they did not use carelessly. Irene Cleves's kitchen at the Four-Way produced a turkey and dressing that people who ate it decades ago still describe with specificity. The collard greens at Army and Lou's, cooked with smoked ham hock in a way that made the pot liquor as important as the greens themselves, were the item that people mentioned first when the restaurant closed and they were asked what they would miss. Sylvia Woods's fried chicken and candied yams and cornbread were the food that a community of Great Migration families had carried north in memory and found reconstructed on a plate on 126th Street in Harlem. The food was not incidental to what these places were. It was the mechanism. The room was built around the food, and the food was the reason the room became what it became. All of it was built on a foundation that required no explanation, because the explanation was too large and too present to need stating. These restaurants existed because the country had made a specific arrangement, enforced by law and custom and violence, in which Black Americans were excluded from or degraded by most of the public commercial life that surrounded them. The Greenwood District in Tulsa had 30 restaurants on North Greenwood Avenue before 1921 because Black Tulsans needed restaurants that did not require the calculation. Mahalia Jackson's Glory Fried Chicken was placed in Black neighborhoods in 8 cities and the Bahamas by a man who had given up a seat on the Tennessee bench to run it, because the argument for why that restaurant needed to exist was visible on every block where it was built. Howard Johnson's orange roof became a landmark on the family road trip map after 1964, because before 1964, the Green Book had to tell you which exits to take and which to pass, and the relief of no longer needing the book attached itself to the chains that were everywhere and reliably open and now legally required to seat you. When the legal framework that had made these restaurants necessary began to change, the restaurants responded in different ways. Some of them continued to thrive, because they had built something that exceeded their original purpose. Others thinned, as the specific urgency that had created them dissipated, and eventually closed. The ones that burned or flooded or went bankrupt for reasons unconnected to their customers lost something else, something harder to name, the specific version of the thing they had been, that could not be rebuilt, even when the building was rebuilt. Willie Mae Seaton was 91 years old when her restaurant reopened after Katrina. She was still frying the chicken herself. When she died in 2015, the restaurant continued. The question of whether what continues is the same thing as what she was doing in that kitchen for 50 years is not a question anyone can answer with confidence, and the people closest to it are the ones least certain about the answer. The restaurants that were simply erased, not closed but physically destroyed, carry their own kind of weight. The Busy Bee, and the Red Rose, and the Square Deal on North Greenwood Avenue in Tulsa were burned in a single night in 1921 by a mob that destroyed 35 blocks of a community's economic life. The people who ran those restaurants went out the next morning looking for new locations because their regulars were counting on them. They rebuilt. They kept operating for another 20 years until desegregation and urban renewal and a highway cut through the district finished what the massacre had not. The restaurants that survived the massacre did not survive the freeway. The freeway was not built by a mob. It was built by a city government, with federal money, under policies that were applied specifically to Black neighborhoods across the country, under the name of urban renewal, which had a different name in the communities that received it. The communities called it Negro removal, because that was the more accurate description of what the policy produced. Shoney's runs in the opposite direction from everything else on this list. The chain that Black families packed into on Sunday mornings across the South for 40 years was simultaneously running a documented operation to ensure that the people in those Sunday morning booths did not encounter Black workers in any role they could see. The kitchen was the boundary. The $132.5 million settlement approved in 1993 was the largest racial discrimination settlement in United States history at the time. The chain that generated the settlement is now 50 locations. The Sunday morning parking lots that were full of families in good clothes coming from church are now, in most of the cities where they operated, something else. What the list of restaurants on this video adds up to is not a story with a clean shape. Some of the restaurants are still open. Some closed because their founders died. Some burned. Some flooded. Some were dismantled by investment structures that collapsed in the hands of people who were not the ones who needed them to hold. Some were quietly erased by policies dressed in the language of progress. Some thinned out slowly, as the community they had been built to serve found other options and exercised them, which was the victory and the loss arriving in the same moment. What all of them shared was the room. The specific room where the calculation had already been made for you, where you arrived and were expected, where the person who took your order already knew what it was, where the booth fit the whole family on Sunday morning, where the food tasted the way food tastes when it was made by someone who understood what you needed it to do. That room existed in a building at a specific address, in a specific neighborhood, in a specific city. When the address changed, or the building came down, or the family could no longer hold the lease, or the water came in, or the company that owned the parent structure collapsed, the room went with it. You did not always know it was going. You found out the way you find out about these things, by arriving and finding the door locked, or by driving past and seeing the sign gone, or by someone at another table mentioning that they heard it closed. The room that had been yours simply stopped being there. No announcement, no occasion to say what it had meant, just the address, and then not the address, and the neighborhood continuing around the space where it had been. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Up next, a basement in Harlem, where the waiters dance the Charleston while balancing trays above their heads, where Billie Holiday failed her very first professional audition, where a young man from Michigan absorbed everything he would later become, and where 61 years of history left no physical trace at all when the room was finally gone. Section 15. Small's Paradise, Harlem Files. The waiter brought your drink while dancing the Charleston. He was balancing a tray above his head and moving his feet in the specific rhythm of a dance that had defined a decade. And the drink arrived at your table without spilling, and the waiter moved to the next table the same way. And somewhere in the room, another waiter was doing the same thing. And another was roller skating between the tables with a tray of his own, and somewhere else in the room, a third was vocalizing during the floor show, and the whole operation was proceeding with a precision that required more rehearsal than most Broadway productions, and that looked, from inside it, like the most natural thing in the world. This was Small's Paradise, in the basement of 2294 7th Avenue in Harlem, and it opened on October 26, 1925, and it ran for 61 years. And when it closed in 1986, it was the longest operating nightclub in Harlem's history, and the building that housed it is now a school. Ed Smalls was born in 1882 and had operated a smaller venue in Harlem called the Sugar Cane Club since 1917, long enough to understand what Harlem wanted from a room and to understand what it was not getting anywhere else. He had built the Sugar Cane Club on the principle that his neighbors were the audience he was designing for, not an audience to be managed around the edges of a white clientele. And when he opened Small's Paradise, he brought that principle into a larger space and a more elaborate operation. The Cotton Club, which occupied the most famous address in Harlem nightlife, admitted white patrons only, unless the patron was a black celebrity famous enough to be admitted as an exception. Connie's Inn operated on the same principle. The major Harlem nightclubs of the Harlem Renaissance era, the clubs that were drawing white New Yorkers uptown for the music and the spectacle of black culture, were not open to the black community that had produced that culture. Ed Smalls was the only major nightclub owner of that era who was both black and who opened his doors to everyone without a racial calculation at the entrance. He also had no cover charge, stayed open later than anyone else, and started a breakfast dance at 6 in the morning that featured up to 30 dancers and a full jazz band. The house band for the first 10 years was Charlie Johnson's orchestra, whose members across that decade included Jabbo Smith, Benny Carter, Sidney DeParis, and Sidney Bechet, which is a list of musicians that tells you something about the level of what was happening in that basement every night. Fats Waller was a regular at Small's Paradise. In 1934, when Waller secured a new recording contract with Victor and needed sidemen, he recruited Harry Dial and Herman Autry directly from the house band at Small's Paradise. The room was that kind of room. In the early 1930s, a young woman was brought to the club for an audition with Charlie Johnson's band. When she was asked what key she sang in, she said she did not know. The audition was unsuccessful. The woman was Billie Holiday, and it was her first attempt at singing professionally. She went on to become Billie Holiday. The audition she failed is preserved in the record, because the room where it happened was the kind of room that kept its own record. W.E.B. Du Bois celebrated his 83rd birthday at Small's Paradise on February 23, 1951. Between 1942 and 1943, a young man from Lansing, Michigan, named Malcolm Little, worked the floor as a waiter. He was absorbing everything: the rhythms of Harlem nightlife, the names and faces of the numbers runners, the etiquette of a room that ran on its own specific rules. He described the experience in his autobiography later, after he had become Malcolm X. He wrote that every day in Small's Paradise was fascinating to him. He wrote that the men who drank there in the afternoon, the hustlers and the men without daytime jobs in the usual sense, had a low murmur of sound and conservative clothes and manners, and that their ease seemed natural and not performed. He was learning what a room at the center of a community taught you about the community, which was something different from what any school had to offer. Ed Smalls sold the club in 1955 to a disc jockey named Tommy Smalls, no relation, who shifted the music and brought in rock and roll. By the late 1950s, the business had declined enough that Wilt Chamberlain, who had become the most famous basketball player in the country after arriving in New York to play for the Knicks, purchased the club in 1961 with a partner named Pete McDougal and renamed it Big Wilt's Smalls Paradise. Chamberlain threw himself into the work with the same physical intensity he brought to basketball, spending 18 hours a day at the club. He changed the music from jazz to rhythm and blues, booked Ray Charles for the opening weeks, and discovered that Tuesday night twist contests were bringing in crowds that filled every seat. He booked Red Fox. He ran the club as a serious operation until the early 1970s, when drug activity had crept into the building enough that it required another reinvention. By 1983, the club was operating as the new Smalls Paradise, offering music and dancing, but also craft shows and political speeches, which is a combination that tells you something about where the neighborhood and the room had arrived by then. Just before the final closing, the New York Swing Dance Society brought the Lindy Hop back to the dance floor, a last echo of the jazz era that had given the club its original character. Smalls Paradise closed in 1986. The Abyssinian Development Corporation, affiliated with the Abyssinian Baptist Church, purchased the building and renovated it. Most of the original structure was demolished, though 2 exterior walls were retained. In 2004, the Thurgood Marshall Academy for Learning and Social Change opened in the space where the Charleston had been danced on a tray for 60 years. The street-level space became a pancake restaurant. Every physical trace of what the room had been was removed in the renovation. What Smalls Paradise was, sits at the center of everything this list has been trying to name. Ed Smalls built a room in 1925 that was specifically for the community around it, in a neighborhood full of rooms that were explicitly not for that community. He made the waiters dance because dancing waiters were the thing that made the room what it was, which was not just a place to drink, but a place that treated the act of being served as its own form of performance and pleasure. He stayed open all night because his community was awake all night and needed somewhere to be. He started the breakfast dance at 6 in the morning, because at 6 in the morning, the musicians had finished their sets at the other clubs and needed somewhere to go, and the community that had been working all day and staying out all night needed a final room before the sun was fully up. The room was built around what the people in it actually needed, not around a projection of what they might settle for. Every restaurant on this list was built the same way. The Four-Way in Memphis had white tablecloths and a bell to ring because Irene Cleves understood that the people in her neighborhood deserved the same standard of care that existed in the downtown restaurants they were not allowed to enter. Pascal's in Atlanta had a private room in the back because the people who were planning the most important political work of the 20th century needed a room that was theirs without qualification. Mahalia Jackson's Glory Fried Chicken had a management school because Benjamin Hooks understood that the people frying the chicken were the same people who deserved to run the operation. Willie Mae Seton was still frying the chicken herself at 89 because she was the one who knew how to do it, and nobody had convinced her that there was a reason to stop. All of it was built in response to the same condition that produced Smalls Paradise in 1925. Black Americans needed rooms that were theirs, not rooms they were tolerated in. Not rooms they were admitted to under specific conditions, rooms that were built for them, that expected them, that were run by people who looked like them, and that held the community the way a room holds people when it was designed with those specific people in mind. The restaurants and clubs on this list were those rooms. They existed in buildings at specific addresses in specific cities. When those buildings came down, or the doors locked for the last time, the rooms went with them. You probably did not have a chance to say goodbye to most of them. You drove past one day, and something else was there. You heard from someone that it had closed. You arrived at an address that no longer had what the address used to have. The room that had been built for you had become something else, and the something else had no record of what had stood there before. And the calculation you were no longer supposed to have to make had returned in a different form, which was the simple arithmetic of absence. What was there? What is there now? What those two things together mean about who the city was built to hold, and who it keeps rearranging itself to move on. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching. and I'll see you in the next one.